The night was cold, damp, and utterly ordinary. It was December 25th, 1991. In the West, families were finishing their Christmas dinners, unwrapping the last of their gifts, and settling in for a holiday evening. But in Moscow, the clocks were ticking down to the death of a superpower. There were no tanks in the streets. There were no mobs storming the gates. There were no air raid sirens wailing into the black sky. In fact, if you were walking across Red Square that evening, glancing up at the illuminated towers of the Kremlin, you might have missed it entirely. At exactly 7:32 p.m., a lone red flag, the hammer and sickle that had terrified the West for 70 years, began to slide down its pole. It didn't fall in battle. It was lowered by a tired worker who just wanted to go home. But behind that quiet moment lies a story of petty feuds, humiliating accidents, and a nuclear briefcase that changed hands in a way that could have ended the world. This isn't the history you saw on the evening news. This is the hidden history of the night the Soviet Empire simply vanished. To understand the end, we have to go inside the fortress. Earlier that evening, Mikhail Gorbachev sat in the walnut room of the Kremlin. He was the president of the Soviet Union, a title that, as of that morning, effectively meant he was the president of nothing. The republics had already declared independence. The army was fracturing. His great rival, Boris Yeltsin, had already seized the Russian ministries. Gorbachev was a squatter in his own office. He was preparing to address the nation on live television to announce his resignation. But even in these final, solemn moments, history decided to play a farce. As Gorbachev prepared to sign the official decree, the document that would legally terminate his command, he uncapped his fountain pen. It was dry. He shook it. Nothing. The leader of a nuclear superpower about to sign his own political death warrant didn't have a working pen. In a moment of supreme irony, he had to borrow a Mont-Blanc pen from the CEO of CNN, Tom Johnson, who was in the room to cover the speech. Think about that. The document ending the Cold War was signed with an American pen, borrowed from an American news executive. It was a small, humiliating detail that the cameras missed, but it perfectly encapsulated the chaos of those final days. The Soviet machine wasn't just broken. It had run out of ink. While the pen incident was embarrassing, what happened next was dangerous. The most critical part of the transition wasn't the flag or the speech, it was the cheget. This was the Soviet equivalent of the nuclear football, the briefcase containing the launch codes for 27,000 nuclear warheads. Protocol dictated a formal ceremony. Gorbachev, the outgoing president, was supposed to hand the briefcase to Yeltsin, the incoming president of the Russian Federation. It was meant to be a moment of continuity, a signal to the world that the arsenal was secure. But Boris Yeltsin was done with protocol. He was done with Gorbachev. Yeltsin refused to come to the Kremlin. He refused to meet Gorbachev face to face. He sent a message. "I'm not coming over there." This was a petulant, personal snub between two men who hated each other, playing out with the highest stakes imaginable. For hours, the nuclear command of the Soviet Union was in limbo. Finally, a compromise was reached. The briefcase wouldn't go to Yeltsin directly. Instead, Soviet Defense Minister Yevgeny Shapashnikov was summoned to the Kremlin to take custody of it. The handoff took place in a hallway. It wasn't solemn. It was awkward. Gorbachev, angry and exhausted, practically shoved the briefcase at the minister. He didn't just hand over a suitcase. He handed over the apocalypse, and he did it with the energy of a man returning a defective toaster. Yeltsin eventually took possession of the codes later, but for a terrifying window of time, the command and control of the world's largest nuclear arsenal was being improvised because of a personal grudge. At 7:00 p.m., the cameras went live. Gorbachev sat before a green baize table. He looked tired. His face was puffy. He began to read. "Dear compatriots, fellow citizens, I hereby discontinue my activities at the post of President of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. He spoke for about 10 minutes. He talked about freedom, about the end of the Cold War, about the mistakes and the achievements. But here is the hidden part. Hardly anyone in Moscow was watching. Interviews with citizens from that night reveal a stunning apathy. In the apartments of Moscow, people were cooking dinner. They were watching entertainment shows on other channels. They were standing in lines for vodka or bread. After years of turmoil, coups, and poverty, the Soviet people were exhausted by history. They didn't care about the speech. They cared that the price of sausages had tripled. One journalist on the street asked a passerby what they thought of the resignation. The man shrugged and said, "Will there be snow tomorrow?" That was the mood. The West was glued to their screens, breathless with the magnitude of the moment. The Russians were just trying to survive the winter. The disconnect between how the world saw the event and how it felt on the ground was absolute. After the cameras cut away from Gorbachev, the real finale began. It happened outside in the bitter cold. There was no fanfare. No military band played the anthem. There was no crowd of thousands cheering or weeping. At 7:32 p.m., two workers climbed to the roof of the Kremlin Senate building. They manually cranked the winch. The red flag with its gold star and hammer and sickle fluttered once and then dropped. It was over. For a few minutes, the flagpole stood bare, a naked spire against the dark sky. Then at 7:45 p.m., the Russian tricolor, white, blue, and red, was hoisted up. It was the same flag that had flown over the Russian Empire before the 1917 revolution. Down on Red Square, a few tourists noticed. A few snapped photos. But the square wasn't packed. It was wet, slushy, and largely empty. One American reporter noted that a group of friends was laughing and drinking champagne near St. Basil's, completely oblivious to what was happening above their heads. The empire didn't fall with a roar. It fell with a shrug. There is one final piece to this puzzle. After the speech, Gorbachev went back to his office to make one last phone call. He called President George H.W. Bush. He wanted to say goodbye. He wanted to assure the American president that the nuclear arsenal was safe. But there was a problem. It was Christmas Day in America. President Bush was at Camp David with his grandchildren. When the call first came through, aides hesitated to disturb him. Imagine the scene. The leader of the Soviet Union, sitting in a room that isn't his anymore, holding a phone, waiting on hold while the President of the United States is celebrating Christmas. Eventually, Bush took the call. It was cordial. It was polite. Bush said, "You'll be in our prayers." Gorbachev hung up. He signed a few last papers, stood up, and walked out of the Kremlin. He didn't even have a government car waiting for him. The ZIL limousines now belonged to Yeltsin. The next day, December 26th, the Supreme Soviet met one last time to formally vote the Soviet Union out of existence. The chamber was half empty. The vote was unanimous. We tend to remember history as a series of explosions and battles. But December 25th, 1991, teaches us something else. It teaches us that empires are fragile things. They are made of paper and ink and symbols. And when the people stop believing in them, they don't always explode. Sometimes they just run out of ink. They get lowered down a flagpole in the dark, while the snow falls and the world keeps turning. The Soviet Union was gone. The long 20th century was over. And all it took was 10 minutes, a borrowed pen, and a cold night in Moscow.